Morning, everyone. I'd like to call to order the Finance and Administration Committee meeting for February 27th, 2025. I would like for Molly to just make a couple of comments about why this is a committee meeting and our new way of going about these.
Thanks very much, Chair Smith. And I'm just going to kind of go over a few things that in our transition of our practice from having all of our committee meetings duly noticed to actually moving in the direction for at least most of the FAC meetings, just to hold them as a committee meeting. So staff has done some kind of looking into this and what other practices are with other districts for committee meetings, because as we said in our discussions over the past year, most committee meetings are not duly noticed at other agencies. We did want to look at some changes on the agenda to kind of help streamline and homogenize the practice so that we didn't have some disparity between the duly noticed committee meetings as well as the regular committee meetings, so we didn't get confused or misstep. So what we've done with respect to committee meetings, we did take off the adoption of the agenda. That's not typically an item that's on a special meeting agenda or a committee meeting agenda. That's just one little simplification. We also did identify items that come before the committees now as either action, and that's just for minutes, or review and comment. So that the idea being that all of the items are really for review by the committees, regardless of whether it's duly noticed or not, and to provide comments and get feedback from each of the members of the committee to staff. So that's going to be the same for all the committee meetings, and that's how we're agendizing items. We will note when items, might require next steps, for example. But the other, let's see, I wanted to go back to the adoption of the minutes for committees because typically we would have a vote on that at a duly noticed meeting, a first and a second, and then a vote. Given that we have two members of the committee, we really don't need to go through that process quite as formally. So I would say that just for the chair to call out, we have the minutes as submitted in the packet. Are there any corrections or comments to the minutes from the committee members? And if not, then the chair can just announce that those are accepted as submitted, and that'll be direction for our board secretary to know that's the formal record of the last meeting. Anything else comes up along the way, we'll be happy to answer questions. But
Okay.
that's a little bit of a
Help coach us along if we
of course.
date in any way, but that makes a lot of sense. Okay, with that said, can I have a roll call, please?
Yes, Vice Chair Diana Mayer
Here.
and Chair Jed Smith.
Here.
Thank you.
Any public comment on non-agenda matters?
Yes, Larry Minikis, please. If you can hold on, sir.
Yes, good morning. And I want to offer my congratulations on Tuesday night's meeting and the passing of PETA 3. And I'd like to reiterate a point I was bringing up, that I think it's very, very important to bring back phase 2 and 3 to the board early to look at, to see what should happen next and not push this off to a later board. I think the board of 2025 should be the board that's remembered for looking forward, looking into the 30s and planning forward. And we have a tremendous amount of issues here. I want to mention something else, which was we'll be able to do this without raising rates. However, we have other tremendous needs in the district, which includes the internal infrastructure, which needs to be funded. And we have so much work to do on the watershed. And we may see more pressure in the future from the public to put more money toward doing that kind of mitigation work. So I just want to make sure we understand that when we go into the next rate increase session, we're going to have to raise rates and people aren't going to be happy with it. And it could be substantial depending on our needs. So I want to be careful going forward that we understand that just because we're going to be able to fund this internally and not raise rates doesn't mean that we're going to have a lot of pressures going forward. Thanks so much.
Great.
There are no further speakers.
Terrific. Okay, so now we'll move to regular items on our agenda, which happens to directly relate to the comments that were just made. I think that you will find us being extraordinarily prudent as we think about our expenses and how we're using the funds that we have raised. And and try to go into the next rate cycle as thoughtful and conservatively as possible. So the beginning of that process and that budget moves are happening now. I'll move to item 3A, which is the minutes for the Finance and Administration Committee meeting. Are there any comments?
No comments.
Okay, so I think we'll reserve that as a approval, and we'll send that over to you, Terry.
Thank you. Accept them.
Great. Any public comment on the minutes?
There are none.
Okay. So 3B, we'll look at the selection of the systems integrator and the SAP implementation services, payroll and human resource modules. Brett and team, thank you.
Good morning, Chair Smith, and take your mics off. There we go. Take two. Good morning, Chair Smith and Vice Chair Mayor. I'm here this morning to talk about our enterprise resource planning system. And I have with me here Brad Taylor, our IT manager. And in the background here, we also have Raj Kowal, our IT supervisor for enterprise applications, who is really taking on a bulk of this effort. And so I'll turn it over to Brad here in a minute to go through the details, but I did just want to provide a little overview. Brad will talk a little bit about what our ERP software is. We've come to the board a few times in the past year, talking about our effort here for a significant modernization effort of our internal financial and operational software. We have SAP right now as our software platform. And as Brad will talk about, we're about 20 years into that project from the first phase. And so we have been spending the last year really kind of plotting out the modernization effort, how we're going to move this into the cloud-based environment, how we're going to kind of really modernize the user experience and really get a lot more out of our software. This has been a multi-department effort over the last year. And at this phase here, as we talking about, this will be the first significant kind of venture into the modernization effort, focusing first this first phase, which we call phase 0, which is basically HR and payroll modules, as we'll just be essentially upgrading that internally as the first phase and then moving our way through the rest of the organization in the coming years. So without any further from me, I'll turn it over to Brad here to talk you through the details.
Great. Good morning, Chair Smith, Vice Chair, Mayor. So as promised, there's going to be a lot of these ERP modernization updates. As Brett alluded to, this is in regards to phase 0. We're calling this phase 0 because it really covers some preliminary and prerequisites that we need to do, some foundational technologies that we need to introduce to kind of move forward with the rest of the project. As Brett mentioned, our ERP system really touches all of the various divisions throughout the district. I love this last little bullet here. The ERP system really is a centralized source of truth for the entire organization. So whether that be HR, finance, procurement, asset management, customer service, basically SAP is our system of record. So phase 0 in this context is really addressing the functions that we perform within human resources in SAP, and we'll be moving those functions to SuccessFactors, which is an SAP product acquired by SAP about 12 years ago. And this really sort of highlights the fact that the new SAP architecture is not monolithic. It's not just all SAP. It's really sort of a composable architecture with multiple best-of-breed solutions. So last time we met, we came for approval to procure SuccessFactors subscription, which we completed in December. SuccessFactors covers, again, HR and benefits management, time entry and payroll, as well as employee self-service functions. So once we implement SuccessFactors, employees will be able to update their personal information via web interface. They'll be able to retrieve pay stubs. They'll be able to make benefit elections all through the self-service module. The software as a service subscription for SuccessFactors was 5 years, a 5-year commitment, approximately about $200,000 per year. That number will shift as we go year to year because there are some kind of inflationary increases that occur each year. So the next slide really sort of lays out, this is the timeline that we embarked on for conducting the RFP process. And it really started back in August of last year, where we actually went through and did some process mapping workshops with a third party called Third Wave that actually created for us maps of the current process, the as-is process, and the to-be process across both HR and payroll processes. The the value of those maps is really, it's essentially sort of a blueprint for the systems integrator to go forward and to implement our system. In the middle of October, we began developing the RFP. We released the RFP middle of November and received responses by December 10th. We then, as a team, reviewed and assessed the various responses, reduced the candidate pool to 3, and then conducted additional vendor interviews in mid to late January. Ultimately, by the end of January, we had selected a winner for that particular RFP process. And now we're in the process of actually finalizing the scope of work and the contract negotiations.
And I would just point out too, in this process, it's been a team effort of IT, finance, and HR. And I know Brad kind of went through that relatively quickly in terms of reviewing the RFP and having follow-up meetings with the top 3 vendors. But that really was a very in-depth process where we scheduled them for multiple hour kind of demonstrations, really got to know the special teams, kind of figure out their product or project methodologies, and really went back and forth to find the best fit overall.
So this slide sort of details a little bit more the RFP process itself. In addition to the RFP, which was fairly exhaustive, there were supplemental questions, about 50 kind of written responses that we solicited from the various systems integrators. A total of 6 systems integrators responded to the RFP and submitted proposals. Cost estimates in these proposals varied from, on the low end, from $950,000 to about $3.4 million. So there was a lot of variability in terms of the cost. These vendors, to give you a little bit of some context, ranged from very, very large systems integrators. SAP themselves have a professional services practice, to more boutique firms that really sort of focus just on SuccessFactors and human capital management solutions. As Brett mentioned, we had representatives from human resources, finance, and IT, basically all participating in the assessment and evaluation process. We reviewed the responses over several weeks, and then ultimately, once we'd reduced to the top 3, had additional meetings with the vendors for them to kind of demonstrate their technical capabilities and their methodologies. Finally, the final recommendation was to go with Phoenix Business Consulting, and it was a unanimous decision on everyone that was on the team and on the panel. So a little bit about Phoenix Business Consulting. They're based in Texas, not in Arizona, as I initially thought. But they are an SAP Gold partner. They have extensive experience with SAP and SuccessFactors, specifically implementations, about 250 or more clients over the past 26 years that they've been in business. And they made sure to let us know that about 80% of their new business basically comes from repeat customers. So they have a very satisfied customer base. I would put them in that boutique category. They were really, essentially, they're really very, very focused on just SuccessFactors, and then work with a broad range of organizations, not just large, like Fortune 500 and 1000 folks. They impressed us with their kind of strong project management and change management methodologies. They were very focused on what the impact of this would have on the organization and on the employees. That was pretty unique in terms of the presentations. They also emphasized the use of automation in sort of the migration process. So rather than sort of brute force manual processes, they leverage various tools to automate and streamline that process of migrating our legacy data from the ECC, which goes back all the way to 2000, to the new system. They were the only vendor who really did not shy away from migrating all of our data. We had a lot of discussions with a lot of the other vendors about establishing sort of a cutoff date that we would not bring data over that was older than a certain amount of time. Phoenix was unique in that they basically were suggesting that we bring everything over with us. So that sort of holistic approach was very impressive. And they definitely have a very strong focus on best practices and are aligned closely with SAP. So now to the important part, what's the total damage? Total cost of the engagement that we're estimating with Phoenix would be about 1.386 million. Of that, implementation and consulting fees is a little over $1 million. And then we have travel costs and project contingencies built into the project of about 320,000. The scope of work in this case with Phoenix includes time entry. So that's going to touch every single district employee, payroll, obviously, core HR functions, benefits administration by the HR team, and then of course, deployment of the employee self-service portal, which again is going to have a lot of impact, I think, to this organization. We included additional integration with other legacy systems. This new SuccessFactors solution is going to have to talk to our existing SAP implementation that's on-prem, as well as some other partners we work with like NeoGov, CalPERS, et cetera. The implementation target for cutover is January 1, 2026. And this is obviously because payroll is involved, is sort of a convenient cutoff date, especially when it comes to tax reporting. The potential challenges we've recognized clearly that November and December can be tough with vacations and people out. So we have built into the project a contingency to basically move that cutover date to April 1st if needed, if necessary. I think what we've talked about with the integrator is having sort of a go, no-go decision sometime in early October to say whether we're going to make that January 1 deadline or whether we're going to push out to April. So that's all I have for you today. Any questions? I'd be happy to answer.
The SuccessFactors software, does that allow employees to say, or I guess require employees to say, non-exempt employees to say, I took a break. This is when I took the break. Do you know?
Time entry is going to remain largely unchanged. Right now we're entering time in SAP, kind of in a timesheet format, almost like an Excel spreadsheet, if you will. We'll be using SuccessFactors time entry tool, but it's not going to be like punching a clock.
Okay.
And I think right now there's a lot of review that goes on internally by managers at the district to look at timesheets prior to them being submitted for payroll processing. That also will not change. We're just going to be largely moving to a new tool. That said, the new tool does have some capabilities in terms of workflow. So for example, if someone's hours exceed a certain threshold, or if time is missing, that was expected to be seen, then, there's some automation in the system to basically notify the managers. Right now, I think our payroll team, our payroll administrators largely are doing a lot of quality control on the timesheets and then basically sort of sending emails out to folks. We'll sort of be able to automate a lot of that.
Great.
But yeah, no time clock, no. That's something that the system's capable of, but that's not something we're looking at.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. It's fun for me to see SuccessFactors. I remember when that company was founded several decades ago, and I was there with the entrepreneurs. Don't have any financial involvement with them, but they've now become a standard bearer, and it's just exciting to see that. It makes sense as a solution for us. I also like your choice of Phoenix. As I've looked into it and talked with Brett, I appreciate the fact that they're going to be able to pull forward historical data, which I think is critical. The idea that we may have lost that, I think, would have been a real problem. So I'm glad that they respect the importance of that kind of trend information. And I also like the fact that they're big enough to be able to handle other modules as we go forward. So it's not just an HR systems integrator, but they can handle other stuff. So I think it's a great choice. It would be good to have an update on other modules, timeline as we roll out the rest of this, making sure we're still on target. Particularly interested in the customer billing and our ability to get AMI up and running as soon as possible. So when do you think we'll have an update on the rest of this project?
Yeah, it's a good question. We are at the beginning phases of the customer billing side. And so we've recently had the customer billing team attend a demonstration from SAP on the software, the underlying software itself. Right now, as you may recall, we are focusing on the customer facing portal. So how they pay, how customers pay online. And so that's the project now for the spring. And we're tentatively slated to start our internal SAP upgrade on that in the fall of this coming year.
Great.
And it'll probably be a similar trajectory in the sense of 3 to 4 months of kind of as is and to be modeling, and then choosing a system integrator as well. So that will be the next phase. And then after that, we'll focus on the more core financial procurement and warehouse functions.
And AMI is happening in parallel to the SAP. We do have a scheduled update that'll be coming, I believe, to maybe the next planning committee on where we are with AMI, and, you know, really starting to firm up with clarity the schedule and approach. And there's a number of different paths and different models as we think about deployment, we'll be discussing with the board and other kind of important considerations.
Cool. Thank you. Any public comment on this item?
There are none.
Okay, great.
Just one more question. So is this engagement, is it through until the implementation of the software? And then it ends, or is that when it really starts to ramp up actually? Are they helping get it going, or to train staff, or both?
Both. And then there is an actual post cutover, post go live support period incorporated into the proposals.
Oh, that's the cutover. Got it. Okay.
I think the term they use is hypercare. So 2 months after go live, they'll be there to support us with anything that goes, you know, awry or any kind of refinements in the end there. So the project itself goes to cutover, and then we go to the hypercare phase.
Great.
Which is that.
Anything else we can do to be supportive or helpful in this?
Cross your fingers for us.
Not easy. You get it. Okay.
No, we'll bring regular updates along the way.
Okay.
And like you said, you know, this is one module. We'll bring other modules, and we'll keep you apprised along the way.
Cool. All right. Item 3C, monthly financial update. Thank you.
Let me get that presentation up. This will be me again. Monthly financial update. You should see it there. I'll go full screen. All right, this is a regularly recurring report as implied by the title. So each month we come to the Finance Committee, provide updates along the way. I would note that this particular month we always look back a month. So this is as of January in terms of the data you're seeing in front of you. And just as another reminder, the January data you see is actually 2 months in arrears from the actual billing cycle. So this would be essentially, you know, December and early January kind of usage and finances. And I would also point out that this month here, January, and then the next 2 month cycle, March, are the two lowest cycles for us in terms of overall, you know, consumption, overall revenues. And so things really do start to slow down. But in my mind, it actually gives us a good chance to kind of see the baseline, kind of the low baseline in terms of the overall kind of revenue curves that go throughout the year with the seasonality. So a good chance to take a look at the numbers here. Kind of final disclaimer here, reminder, you know, we do a 2 month billing cycle. So every month you're kind of getting half of that billing cycle. So we're kind of in the first, you know, half of this winter billing cycle. So it's not a complete picture, but it is a chance to kind of continue to paint the trend. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one today, as we do have 2 other items, but I'm happy to answer any questions that come up along the way. Revenues continue to be pretty much on track. You know, each month we go up or down 1% or 2, but in general, we're on track to where we generally expect to be this time of the year in terms of budget actuals. You can see the seasonality there at the top, where we're 58% of the fiscal year, but we do have 63% of our overall revenues in terms of water revenues, our largest revenue source. So that kind of implies that we got the bulk of our revenues in the late fall from the kind of summer seasons. Now we're getting into the kind of slower months, and we'll catch up, and you'll start to see that kind of convergence back towards the linear trend. You can kind of compare it to last year to see we are on track better in terms of comparison of the budget compared to last year. The other lines on here, you know, other revenue is basically kind of a smaller portion for us. A lot of our kind of non-rate revenues, those are on track as well right now. We do have a couple grants in there, so those kind of do skew some of the numbers, but in general, they're small in comparison to the overall total revenue. Capital revenues in the bottom there, those are much more regular. That's almost primarily sourced by our capital maintenance fee, which is a fixed fee. So we expect that to be, almost essentially online with the linear target each year in terms of our overall capital revenues. So at the bottom line, total operating capital, we're at 62% of the fiscal year, which is a good spot to be in. Slightly below where we might want to be in terms of the ideal situation. But as we'll see here on the next slide with expenditures, we are also below. And so if we're making a little bit less revenue than the budget, but also spending less, then we're actually in a pretty good balance right now. So expenditures here, personnel services are tracking along. Again, they're a little bit behind the linear kind of calendar year, so 55%. You can see we've increased that compared to the prior year. So personnel services last year were at 53% of the budget. Now we're at 55, and that reflects kind of the increased hiring and filling of vacancies. So it's a good sign for us. Maintenance operations, that's the one that's lagging the most this year so far. Some of that's purchased water. We've had good years last year in terms of overall rain here, so we haven't had to purchase as much water ahead in the year. We've also seen some kind of delay, at least, in some of the paving costs that we were seeing a year or two ago. So those are kind of really the big pieces holding our expenses down in terms of the linear track. Again, this will pick up a little bit in the spring as we get more activity across the district. Total operations, 51% at the bottom there. That's where we expect to be a comfortable place in general. And then capital down there, I believe we got a good update from the capital team last week. And so they are ahead of schedule in many respects, and especially in terms of the contracts encumbered. And so this shows that they're at 58% of the fiscal year, which is right on track dollar-wise. And that was a big gain from where we were in the fall. So kudos to the capital team for getting a lot of these larger contracts moving. And a lot of the actual expenses will come later here in the summer, or in the spring and the summer. So overall, I feel pretty comfortable with where we're at expenditure-wise. Bottom line, we're showing a little bit of savings, and that'll really help inform kind of where we're at for budget projections, as you alluded to, Director Smith, as we get into the next couple months of budget planning. These will be some of the final inputs for where we think we're going to end the year, both on revenues and in expenses. But these kind of start to help paint the picture, and we'll bring back more of that kind of projection-based information in future items, a little bit here today, and then also in the next coming finance meetings. Great. This is a breakdown, kind of more detail on our water sales revenue. As I showed on one of those first slides, it's our largest revenue source. It is really broken down into these four categories, with the largest piece of that being our variable water sales on the left there. Again, you can see the budget kind of up 1 month, down the next month. That kind of reflects our 2-month billing cycle. And you can see this January, February, and March timeframe is really kind of our low months for revenue. So we'll get that low baseline filled in next month in February, kind of turn that into forward-looking projections for the budget planning cycle. Service charge is a fixed fee, so that one stays pretty flat year to year, month to month. Same with capital maintenance fee. So happy to answer more questions on this, but it really is kind of one of those smaller kind of monthly cycles, and so I don't want to kind of take too much time on this, but it is good that we do check it each month just to make sure we're kind of in line with our month-to-month targets. Water consumption here. We dipped a little bit this last month. So you may recall we've been kind of trending pretty close to that 10-year average. And I think last month we actually touched it. This month we dropped down a little bit. This is a cumulative look, through January, through 7 months of the year. We're still seeing that steady kind of 1 to 2 to 3% per year increase in terms of our overall trend, but it is still significantly down from where we were in fiscal year 20 and 21. I think we talked about that a little bit on Tuesday, and since some of those kind of long-term projections we made back in fiscal year 20 and 21 have since kind of been reset with this kind of more kind of longer lasting, lower consumption environment that we're in. And so I think we're at a good balance here for, I think, understanding where our customers are in terms of consumption and having the rates reflect that. So from a financial footing basis, we're in a good place. And we're also in a good place from a conservation and from a using water efficiently place. So again, I think this last month was probably a little bit of an anomaly in the sense that it was kind of reflecting some of those colder November and December time periods, so low water use, but again, continuing a healthy overall trend of slight rebound, but still well below long-term averages. So in summary, our rate revenues through 7 months are just slightly below our budget, by 1% or so. That's offset by savings on both operating and capital sides, with capital now just ticking up to the kind of the linear trend we'd expect it to be. Our water consumption through the first 7 months is about 5% more than last year, and it's within 1% or 2% of our budget amount. So again, we're good there. In January itself, as I noticed, there was a slight downturn, this January compared to last January. If you compare two kind of low points there, we were 10% lower than the prior year. And I kind of want to wait till I see one more month of that to kind of, read too much into it, other than it was probably just more of a colder and a wetter month in comparison to last January. So that completes my monthly report. I'm happy to answer any questions there.
Great. Director
Just,
Mayor.
so our fiscal year starts in July, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
July 1st. Yep.
Yep, all good. Thank you for the update. No questions. Any comments, Terry?
Yes, Larry Minikis, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a suggestion on the water consumption data, that what's added to that is the rainfall totals for each month. I started to run the numbers real quick, and if you look back at 2019, we were very low. About what I can find was 10 inches at Lake Lagunitas. I'm not sure how accurate that number is because I was rushing it. And as you can see, for 2020 and 2021, we know we were very dry in January. So there's that correlation. I just think it would be helpful to see those two numbers together. So thank you.
Thank you. There are no further speakers.
All right, terrific. Any other comments or support, Brett, that we can give you here? Or you all set on the monthly update?
No, I'm set there. I think a lot of that, like I said, will kind of make its way into the next couple finance meetings
Yep.
as we talk about budget and kind of ongoing projections.
Great.
But for now, I'm okay.
Yeah, just a reminder,
Yep.
with the commenter and just for all of us, because we lose track. When we see water supply numbers, we're seeing the actual demand for that month. When we're looking at it with the finance presentations, we're talking about the billed water, which is right, we do a 2-month billing. So the January bills reflect generally the 2 months prior to that if we look at correlating it with rain.
Terrific. Okay, moving on to our item 3D quarterly investment report.
And that'll be me again. I don't have a presentation for this one. It's a quarterly report we do by statute. And so each quarter we submit this to the board of directors for review, for public review. I think what I would note on this item is typically it's a finance committee only item, but with this change into a committee meeting and not a dual notice meeting, I will include this on the consent packet also on Tuesday so that the full board has a chance to see it within their report. So I've noted that in the report for Tuesday, but for today we can take a deeper dive into it. And so the gist of this is we continue to see a good, healthy return in terms of our overall investments. Our fund balances have increased to a little over 100 million, which is a good thing. I would note there's a little bit of timing issues here. So this is going to reflect the end of December 31st, which is right when we get our kind of first allocation of fire flow tax revenues. So we do get 2 installments of property tax revenues, one in December and one in June. And so this kind of, we get an influx of our capital fire flow fee here in the revenues, and we spend it throughout the year. So it's a little bit of a blip in terms of overall fund balance that we're carrying. That should go down as we go into the spring and into the summer as we spend those revenues. But it really is that fire flow fee that kind of really puts it over the top for the month. Overall, investment earnings now have totaled 1.8 million for the year, and that's well in excess of prior year trends. And so that'll be, again, something we'll reflect in the upcoming budget cycle. I think I've talked about it a few times, but it is always hard to kind of project, obviously, interest rate revenues. And so we're at a high point now. Those can go down quickly. And so we'll probably be, try to find that happy medium in terms of budget planning for, what's the right level for the next 2 years. But it is a good thing, and it's helping us to kind of buffer some of those little bit of rate revenue kind of shortfalls. We're kind of making up for it here on the investment market. So I would remind the board that pretty much the entirety of our investments right now are very conservative. They're in what's called LAIF, which is Local Agency Financial Investment Pool. And that's primarily all just government T-bills and very long-term and conservative investments. And we also have a money market fund that's, again, very conservative, but we are trying to make sure we're kind of making at least market rates on kind of the conservative side of the portfolio. And I will be bringing back in either next month or the month after our actual investment policy for board review. Just as a reminder, we do have that as a requirement once a year to review our investment policy. And then this report comes out once a quarter for board and public review. So happy to answer any questions there the board may have.
No questions. Thank you.
Great, all good. Happy to have those returns to help us out, and let's be conservative and save it and be as tight as possible. And any public comment, Terry?
There are none.
Okay, terrific. So move on to item 3E, please, the budget update.
Let me bring this one up here. Okay, budget update, and I think we'll spend some extra time here if that's okay, just because this is a new item. And I would just kind of preface this with, this is probably what we might call a kickoff to the budget planning. I'll talk through kind of where we're at internally and where the calendar will be, but this is the first time we've talked about kind of the next 2-year budget cycle for fiscal year 25 and 26, and then also 26 and 27. I'll just give a little bit of background for the board and for the public, kind of, our budget process, talk about where we're at, currently with our current budget, and then start to kind of take a little bit of a deeper dive into what the cost drivers are going forward, and some of the recent and expected changes to our capital program. And then I'll really talk about what's going to be coming to the board and to this finance committee over the next 2 to 3 months as we kind of hone in and start to really refine our budget estimates. So a process map here as we develop the budget, we're now here, kind of midwinter. So kind of rewinding that, in the late summer, we do our final accounting, and we have our audit report we reported a few months ago. So we do year-end accounting. That's kind of our first look at our financial analysis and trends. In the fall, we take that first crack at updating what we call our baseline budget. So what we currently have on the books without any changes, what are the revenues looking like in terms of rate revenues? Are there any unknown expense drivers or kind of unanticipated expense drivers? At this point in the winter now, we are beginning our division budget meetings, meaning we're meeting with each of the divisions across the district to kind of get, a little bit more information into kind of what they're seeing, what pressures they're having, any emerging needs that they're finding, any proposed enhancements that they would like to start working through. We're starting to flesh those out and really starting to put dollars for those. In the spring, we'll come back and kind of have a district-wide discussion on prioritization. So if there are any changes to make or any kind of swaps within the budget, we'll bring those to the board for review. And we'll also finalize our revenue projections. And I mentioned that in the last or 2 items ago. We have kind of about 6 months of data now, and we'll kind of supplement that as we go until we get to about May or so. And then we'll kind of finalize those revenue projections. And then in early summer, which typically means late May and early June, we'll do a full-on budget study session. So we'll have all the division directors come and kind of give you an overview of their budget, and then we'll have a final proposed budget for the board to consider and do an adoption likely in June. So just as a reminder, we did have our district-wide budget goals in the last budget process, and these are consistent with our strategic plan, but they're very targeted in the sense that we want to strengthen our water supply reliability. We want to build upon our water and wildfire resiliency on Mount Tam watershed. We need to keep pace with inflation and invest in our aging infrastructure, and that's something we'll talk about here today. And then in the last budget cycle, we were so low in reserves, we had to replenish our reserves to prepare for uncertainties. And that's something you'll start to hear us talk about more, is that, now that we've made a lot of progress towards that, we may not need to have that as a primary goal going forward, as long as we keep our eyes on it. So that may be a goal that can come off in the next budget cycle. For our budget currently, as I mentioned, we have a 2-year budget process. In the middle of that, we do a mid-cycle review, because knowing that our budget is so dependent on, climate and water consumption, we want to make sure we're at least looking at that. We're not just being blind for 2 full years. So we come back as a mid-cycle review. We'll do that in the summertime between the 2 cycles. And within our 2-year budget process, we have what's called a 5-year capital plan. So you'll start to see that from the capital team over the next couple of months. The board will approve 2 years at a time, but you can kind of get a sense for where the 5-year trajectory is going. And so that kind of helps fill in some of the longer term projects, as many of our, especially our large projects, have more than a 2-year life to them. So it's good to see the 5-year plan in addition to the 2-year budget. Our current budget right now, just for kind of context, is $163.8 million. That combines both our operating and our capital funds. Our operating fund is about $100 million. It's $109 million. And that covers our day-to-day operations. It covers our water treatment and pumping costs. It also captures our debt service costs. Our capital fund is now $49 million, and I'll talk about how that's grown over time. That includes the typical capital projects that you see kind of in any agency. It also captures our water supply enhancement, or our roadmap that we talked about this last Tuesday. And then kind of behind the scenes, it also captures our equipment replacement and vehicle needs, kind of a more minor dollar figure, but still a critical piece for ongoing operations for us. So that's the 2 major cuts: $109 million for operations and about $50 million for capital. When you kind of break that out, across the entire district, kind of more visually speaking, this is where the big buckets are. So personnel services, all of our staffing is about a third of our budget there, bottom right, 55 million. Capital projects there, bottom left is another, about a third, 29 or 30%, 48 million. A contribution to reserves in the green there on the right, that was a new item, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That's 5 million. Operations and materials, kind of day-to-day type of a thing, is another third or so, 45 million in the top right. And then we do have our debt service right now, which is currently 9.4 million up there at the top left. And I put that in gray because in my mind, that's also kind of part of our capital program. It's a piece of it. Our operating budget pays for it, but it really is in support of all of our capital projects. So really, if you combine our debt service and our capital projects, that puts that into kind of, almost 35-40% or so of our budget. Obviously, we have to make revenues to support those expenses in each of those areas. And so this is the way our revenues kind of look in a pie chart. You can see our, relatively heavy reliance on water sales. And again, that's variable. And so that's why we spend so much time talking about that on a month-to-month basis, and certainly looking back and looking forward. That is our water rates, essentially our non-fixed fees there. So water sales, 60% of our overall revenue, over 100 million. Service charge and capital maintenance fee there towards the top right. Those are both fixed fees. And so those are kind of slow and steady as they go, but they make a very important kind of bottom layer to our overall revenue structure. Watershed management fee there on kind of the far right, 5 million. And then I just mentioned fire flow fee in the last item. That is every year the exact same amount. That's $75 per property here in our service area. It adds up to $4.5 million a year, very steady. Grants, right now we have 4.5 million, and those are funding the two large projects we have in Marin City in the canal area, as well as some smaller projects in the watershed. Those do come up and down depending on the grant cycles, but right now we have those in the current budget of 4 million. And then other revenues, again, that's non-rate revenues and interest earnings, add up to about 4 million. So generally speaking, it's a heavy reliance on water sales, but we do have a lot of other important components of our revenue structure embedded there as well.
This pie chart is just to some extent shows Vice Chair, Mayor, kind of the balance that water agencies strive of the variable, which is water sales, and then the fixed fees that are established from a financial standpoint. You'd want more in the fixed fees for certainty. From a pure conservation to send a signal to ratepayers, you'd want more on sales. So it's, always looking for that right balance of confidence yet promoting wise water consumption.
Okay, and then another kind of way of looking at the district is through our org chart, our operating divisions. So I mentioned with you, we're beginning to meet with all the divisions to learn more about their kind of individual budgets. And as you'll start to see, many of our presentations will be framed this way in terms of, where the dollars go, where the people are, and where kind of a lot of the expenditures do happen. So we have 5 main operating divisions there on the bottom: administration, engineering, operations, watershed, and water resources. And then, of course, you can see at the top there, we have our general counsel department and our office of the general manager, all of which report to the board. And so this is a kind of a clean and easy org chart. The next one will show you kind of how the dollars get spent there. And this is just our operating budget, as our, capital budget is kind of separate from that, and largely would be in engineering, but it does cover areas including watershed and operations. So this is just our operating budget. It gives you a sense for where the people and where the kind of largest divisions are. So clearly the largest division there, bottom right, is operations, right? It's about over 40% of our overall district here. And they're really out there doing the day-to-day work. We have a large, it's over 100 FTE or close to 100 FTE in that division. And so it makes up a big portion of our expenses. And they also are responsible for, water production and the treatment plants, water distribution, and all the emergency repairs that do go on. So a big, important part of the district. I'm kind of coming around counterclockwise. Administration, that covers, about 17%. That's finance, that's meter reading, that's customer service, that's IT. Engineering is a similar size there, about 10 million a year, top left. And we'll be expanding that. I think this again, this kind of reflects our fiscal year 25 budget. So it doesn't include the additional staff that we've approved there in the last couple months. And so that number will go up slightly in comparison to other departments as we prepare for the next budget. Watershed, again, similar there, 11%, $8 million a year. And then water resources, which includes water efficiency, is another similar 10% or so, $7 million a year. And then if you add all, the board, legal, and GM, that comes out to about 6% a year. So again, a lot of this is just context as we get into kind of more, in-depth presentations going forward. I just wanted to make sure we kind of lay these out here so we have a sense for where the numbers are, where the bigger expenditures are. Okay, this is kind of just, again, more of a reminder kind of where we were and where we are now in terms of the budget, because we did make some significant changes in the last budget cycle. And I think, these bar charts to me help me realize really where the board's kind of priorities were, where our investments were headed, and also where some of our fixed costs, some of the things that are out of our control hit in our budget. So personnel services did go up, and we did have, labor negotiations and contracts. And so those ended up going up about 6% over 2 years. So, about 3% per year. So about what you would expect. Materials and supplies went up more significantly, and those went up to about 40% increase over the 2-year cycle. A lot of that was readjusting the budget towards electricity costs, towards fuel costs, towards water purchases are included in there, chemicals are included in there, as well as insurance. So we had 4 or 5 really large ticket items, and I'll detail those for you in the next slide. They really were kind of non-discretionary or kind of beyond the control, kind of required input costs for us. So that was a relatively large increase in terms of, percentage wise. But the biggest percent, so, by far, was our capital investments, right? So we basically doubled our capital investments. You can see there was about a 93% increase over the 2 years. And that was well talked about and kind of well, understood in the sense that includes both kind of repairing our current infrastructure needs, starting to invest in what we call deferred maintenance, so some of the larger projects that hadn't been funded fully in the past. And then this also includes the $9 million investment in the roadmap, the water supply roadmap. So that was a more significant and intentional increase into our capital program. And then you can see on the far right there, we did not have a line for contributions to reserves in the past. And so that went from 0 to 5 million. And just for kind of, again, reminder, 2.5 million per year was meant to increase our water supply project reserve. And so that will continue going forward. And the other 2.5 million per year was to increase our unrestricted operating reserve. And that's likely the one that we'll recommend not continuing, because I think we'll be in a good enough place not to have to overtly fund that in terms of a top line expense category next year. So again, this is just for context for where we were, where we are now, and then we'll fill this in with kind of where we'll be recommending over the next 2 years.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. On the one hand, it looks like, oh, wow, we're spending a lot more on capital. The way I look at this is that this board and agency has approved a historic investment in our maintenance and in our infrastructure. I'm proud of the ability that we have given ourselves to update these important systems for our customers. So this is truly magnificent work and reflects the increase in the rates that we did. And I'll have another comment on that after the slide.
And this is just adding some of the numbers to those slides before. So I know that for some of us, it's easier to see visual. Some of us like to see the hard numbers. I try to give a little bit of both with these type of presentations. So compare it again to the 22-23 budget, or deferred maintenance and kind of core capital projects. We added about 10 million a year towards the water supply roadmap, as we mentioned and talked about on Tuesday. That's about 9 million a year. Purchased water and water treatment, I'll talk about that here in a minute. That's largely, purchases from Sonoma, and it's also the water treatment costs, which is electricity and chemicals. And so that went up about $5 million over the 2 years. I just talked about the reserves. Personnel services were more, kind of expected and inflationary, a couple percent per year. Paving contracts were a big line item last year on their own. Like I said, we're working with engineering and operations to kind of determine what's the best long-term plan for that, because it does come up and down and it is largely beyond our control. But at least in the short term, we're seeing good news there in the sense of our costs aren't increasing as fast as we thought they might. And so that'll be a line we'll take a look into. And then insurance, I know we talked a little bit about wildfire resiliency and kind of the impacts of the new fire severity maps in previous board meetings. Some of that is reflected in the insurance kind of adjustments there. We'll be hearing from our insurance brokers again in the coming months. A lot of this it is fire related, but a lot of it's just, California property market and liability markets and the overall insurance industry. And so these will be coming our way again. We're not going to see as large of increases, hopefully, but we still will see each year probably in excess of inflation, especially on the property and liability markets, some insurance pressures. So more to come there. We did a big reset the last 2 years, and I'll give you more information in the spring on that line item. All right, so I'll give you a second here to kind of get your eyes squared away to this chart. This is inflation, and it's something I talked about a lot 2 years ago, but what I really wanted to kind of talk about here is, we are subject to inflation that's not like the typical inflation you hear about in terms of, national inflation levels or even some of the Bay Area CPI. So CPI is Consumer Price Index. That's a weighted basket of all the things a typical consumer would use. So, it includes a variety of services that we all do in our personal lives. There's obviously a difference there. That's the gray bars you see. So there's a gray bar there for the US CPI, which is what you hear in the news. We focus a lot here on the San Francisco CPI because it's the Bay Area kind of, equivalent of that. And you can see generally that's the orange bar that generally exceeds the gray bars across historically. So that just typically says the Bay Area inflation is higher than, US-wide inflation, which I think we would all generally understand. The interesting piece there is that in the COVID year in 2021, the US CPI vastly outpaced the San Francisco CPI for that 1 year. And it's been a little bit higher, in 2023 as well. When I looked into that at the time, that was more so because we had such a higher base that kind of, relatively speaking, when costs increase, across the country during that kind of, short-term period, the costs were felt much more kind of by the lower cost areas than they were here where we're used to higher costs anyway. So it's a relative number, but we're starting to see that at least the last 2 years, 23 and 24, be, kind of more in that 3% range. That's a good thing. This is overall good news that inflation is somewhat subsiding, or at least going back to where it was, pre-COVID, in the sense of that 2 to 3 to 4% range. And so you can see over there, 23 and 24, the San Francisco CPI has been, 2.9% and 3.2%. So generally back where you expect it to be for long-term planning purposes. So it's a good thing, kind of return to stability, return to normalcy. The blue bar there is what I wanted to point out again here is that's what's called the San Francisco ENR, which is the Engineering News Record Service. And they do what's called a construction cost impact or construction cost index. And that's basically saying how much does it cost to do construction projects in the Bay Area. And so you can see that, kind of goes up and down in history, compared to the overall CPI, again, that 3, 4, 5%. But starting in about 2020, around those COVID times, we saw a 5%, something in the 3% range, then a 14% increase. So we really felt that during the last rate cycle and during the last couple of years, in the sense of double-digit increases in construction costs, and that impacts all of our capital projects as well as some of our kind of ongoing maintenance. So that was a big adjustment to try to get ourselves, aligned to that. And you can see there in the far right, there is not much of a blue bar at all, right? We have a tick of one there in 2023 and actually pretty much 0% here in 2024. So there's two kind of ways to look at that. Number one, we're returning back to normal, in a dramatic way there. And so we expect prices not to be increasing in that double-digit range anymore. We'll kind of apply that 3 to 5% marker probably going forward there. But I would also note that none of those are negative. So it's not like we've seen prices go backwards. We've just leveled off at that really high level from 2022. So again, there's kind of two ways to look at that. Number one, we probably don't need to have such high inflationary assumptions going forward, but we're still kind of dealing with the high baseline that was left over by the COVID and the kind of the follow-up days from there. So good news overall. I see this as a good news slide, and that we're at least back in normal ranges of inflation, and that's not something we have to necessarily, build into our long.
Yeah, I'm going to be keeping, or we're all going to be keeping a close eye on this as we think about budget going forward, and then obviously rates. So, we are even different than these norms, averages, but
Yep.
Our chemical costs were just off the charts, and steel, et cetera. It looks like it's coming back, but I'm hopeful that this trend will continue and that we do not have to have a major rate shift like we did a couple of years ago. I'm super hopeful that that was a unique time where we made up for years of being behind on increasing rates, and that we'll get back to more of a normalized, relatively low increase that's steady going forward as we have in our long-term strategic plan. So thank you.
And then as you mentioned in your last comment there, those are kind of those index averages or kind of like broader ranges. And so, what we've been trying to do is take a little bit more kind of a granular look to what our actual costs are here. And so these are two, again, these are key inputs for us here. So at the bottom, we have electricity in the San Francisco market as a kind of a inflationary index. We also have our own independent kind of analysis on our Sonoma water unit cost, right? There's just as an aside, there's two pieces of our Sonoma cost. It's how much we take in and how much they're charging us per unit. So how much we take in changes year by year depending on the weather, but this just compares the unit cost. So you can see in the orange there, electricity, which is a little over 5 million a year for us. So, 5% or so of our operating budget. Those increases over the last 5 years have all been, double digits, average well over double digits, but 8%, 9%, 20% almost, 10%, and then 18 again. So electricity, this is the PG&E kind of, rate passed through to us. And this is just, general San Francisco. So this includes, consumers as well as businesses. So that's going to be something we have to keep our eye on is what's the projected, PG&E costs and our overall electricity costs. And then underlying that, we also have, again, around, 10 million or so for Sonoma water purchases. Those had been relatively, normalized or whatever, at least 19, 20, and 21 in that 3 to 5% range. Last year, we saw an 11% increase. And this year, we're looking in the range of 10% again. So they're finalizing their budgets in the next month or two, but you'll see me add a chart to this or add a year to this in the next coming months, and that's going to be in the double digits as well. So on two of our larger line items, both being, 10 million or 5 million, one's 5, which is electricity, and others 10, which is Sonoma purchases, we're seeing double digit impacts still. So those will be items we have to look at, and we'll have to find kind of that right balance for future projections. But those are, two of our cost pressures going forward would be electricity and water purchases. And just to kind of unpack electricity a little bit more, I've seen this chart a couple times. I thought it'd just be good to share with the board and the public. The orange line there being electricity costs in California overall, and the blue line being electricity costs nationwide. And so you can see how, going back to the early 2000s, they mostly moved in concert with each other. California's always had a little bit of a premium cost for electricity. So what used to be a 40% or so kind of, increase compared to or spread compared to the US markets over the last 10 years has really taken off in California. You can see the upward line in California electricity costs for a variety of reasons. But now we're basically paying double what the rest of the country pays, right? We're paying in California, we're paying 29 cents, per kilowatt hour. The rest of the country's paying about 13 cents. I have a note there on the far right that, we're even higher than that. And so Marin Water, we pay about 34 or 35 cents per kilowatt hour right now. And that's increased 40% since 2022. And so as a reminder, we have Marin Clean Energy, we're deep green in that. And so we pay for it. We also are a very heavy user. And so the averages don't always apply to us. But in this case, we're much higher just than the California average overall. So again, just more context and kind of more data. And we'll unpack some more of this as we go through. But we are considering electricity and water prices to be probably some key increases in the budget. Okay, so I'll kind of take a step back here and talk in words rather than charts and numbers. So we know that our expenditures are increasing faster than our revenues. And so a lot of that's what I just talked about, water, electricity. I'll come back next month to talk a little bit more about our personnel costs and some of our insurance assumptions. So health benefits is another thing that we're seeing, increased pressure on. I'll have more information on that next month for you. We already have our rates set for the next 2 years. I think Director Smith, you mentioned that a few times. So the overall rate increase for next year will be around 10% in terms of revenue to the district. And so we'll need to kind of make sure our budget is in line with that. We have kind of a I don't want to say prepackaged, but the underlying financial plan that goes with the rate increase would include new funding, meaning additional funding for large projects and deferred maintenance next year. And we'll have the capital team talk about where our initial prioritization for those projects are in next year. We have AMI scheduled for funding beginning in the year 2 of the next budget cycle. And so I think as Ben mentioned, we'll have an update from the AMI team coming soon in terms of how that timing and the RFP goes and the cost choices that we have in terms of implementation. And then revenues, even though we know we have, kind of a financial plan and we have the rate package already set, it will still depend largely on consumption. And so I talked about that in the monthly financial report. We've been a little below budget, but able to offset that with expenditure savings or other revenues in terms of our, in comparison to our rate revenue projections. And I have a chart on that here on the next slide. And so, we'll have to refine that a little bit, but we're still in a nice range where it's not going to be a huge change or huge revision. I think we're seeing kind of a relatively consistent trend that we can manage to. And then, as I also mentioned in a previous item, our interest earnings are better than anticipated. They've been kind of an offset to our rate revenue shortfalls, and we'll be able to bake that into our budget going forward, at least in the short term, to hopefully be able to minimize any impact on any expense, adjustments there. So just to kind of finally give one more chart here of kind of where rate revenues were in fiscal 23, which was kind of the end of the last rate cycle. We had a shortfall of over 13 million in comparison to budget. So that's when we were effectively, $1 million per month short of where we needed to be. We had to drastically cut our expense budget and our capital budget just to maintain solvency there. With the increased rates here, you can kind of see that the budget goes up and the actuals go up. So fiscal 24 and fiscal 25. Last year, we ended up with a shortfall of about 8 million, which was again offset by a variety of, expenditure savings, interest earnings. And we also had some grants, the COVID relief grant that kind of helped even that out. And then this year, as we're starting to look forward for a projection, I'm seeing a projection shortfall of about 6 million, maybe 6.5 right now, but I need to kind of fill that in over the next 2 or 3 months with some of the more spring data and some of the final winter baseline data. So, as we get into that may be something we have to work towards, is closing that $6 million or so a year gap. And as I mentioned a few times, that's kind of part of that will be covered with interest earnings. Part of that's covered with not having to contribute to reserves. And then hopefully the rest of that is relatively manageable in terms of, financial planning for the next 2 years. So I think we'll have a good process for the board to consider. I think we'll have some good deep discussions on kind of where expenses are within the district and where to prioritize our capital funding going forward in the next.
I mean, imagine what would have happened if we hadn't raised rates. I mean, this would have been a really rough time. Untenable.
Yes, definitely. So just to recap, and again, next steps in coming months here, we are meeting right now with individual departments and divisions to finalize our cost estimates and identify any other unanticipated expenditures. Capital project planning is underway under a separate track, and so the capital team will be making various updates in the next few months for you. That will include water supply enhancement projects, roadmap projects, prioritizing our existing capital portfolio and any deferred maintenance needs. And we'll bring back more of a deep dive into that in April, so 2 months out. We'll have a budget workshop in May of 2025, and that's the time when we'll get presentations from each division director. We'll kind of cover operating items and recap the capital and kind of have another chance to take a look at how capital feeds into that. And then we'll take all of that back with the board's direction, and we'll kind of put that into our final budget proposal, and we'll bring that to the board in June.
Yeah, Chair Smith, I agree, untenable. And I think that's even an understatement. Just our financial stability and ability to get our work done today is really fundamentally different than when you and some colleagues came onto the board. I mean, it's really, we're now a relatively strong water district in so many aspects that we struggled with in a real material way that did threaten to some extent our ability to meet our core mission.
Yeah. Understood. All set with that presentation?
Yep.
Okay, great. No comments more from me. Terry, any public comments?
Yes, Mr. Larry Menikis, please.
Third time is the charm. Brett, really appreciate what you're doing as an art for us non-financial people to be able to understand what is going on in the district. And it's really appreciative because there's a lot going on here. Where I want to focus is on slide 9, which is the operating expenditures by division. And I think what would be helpful to see is a historical chart over, say, 10 years of, has there been a shift in the way we've been funding different divisions? I think it'd just be helpful to understand this data. And that's my comment. Thank you so much. Oh, and one last one. It's shocking to see that we're paying 34 cents per kilowatt hour because I believe my family up in Oregon is running a business up there. And we had a discussion. I think they're at 11 cents, just to show you the contrast up there. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. Terrific. All right, Brent. Well, thanks for the update. And we'll move for upcoming meetings, which the next one is of the Finance and Administration Committee and special meeting of the Board of Directors is on March 27th, 2025 at 9:30. And we will adjourn this meeting. Thank you very much.